it does scare me to think about how big the distractions might get.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in Massachusetts.
I mean, could there be some a war? Could there be some horrible crackdown? I would say that if Trump, were to institute something like martial law, maybe we would stop talking about the Epstein files.
So what is going on with the Jefferey Epstein files? And why do many religious people not seem to care about it very, very much? I care about it, in part because they're trying to cover it up so much. And I'm curious why Mike Johnson forced an early summer break for Congress, and there's so many distractions happening that they're trying to pump out, specifically about President Obama. And I'm just curious if this is some sort of excuse that we're offering once again for Donald Trump around sexual abuse charges. And so this week, I wanted to take some time with one of my favorite commentators, attorney and author, Rabbi J. Michaelson. Please make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Our library of past conversations includes well over 100 hopeful, empowering, inspiring interviews with guests like Congressman Eric Swalwell, Maggie Siddiqui, the writer Jeff Sharlett, Bishop Marion Buddy, and many, many others. You can help grow The State of Belief with a financial contribution right now. Find out more at stateofbelief.com, and you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. Let me say thank you to all of you, our listeners, for some break, for some vacation. We took a couple weeks off to refuel, to recharge, and I am so grateful for that opportunity. I know my producer, Ray Kirstein, who I think has not had a break in 15 years, also was grateful. And so we thank you, and just know that we are coming back really ready to go. So thank you again. And before we get to our guests, I do want to talk about something related, which really got to me this week. And it was a video that the current president of the United States posted of him in the Oval Office with President Obama, and then people coming in and arresting President Obama with force, taking President Obama to prison, and images of President Obama in prison. And this was done with AI video, of course. I found it so offensive, and it just, I know he's doing it to distract us from Epstein and all the ineptitude and all the cruelty. But this felt like, okay, we're going to just let this happen. Everyone in Congress is just going to let this happen. All the commentators are just going to say, oh, okay, that's just another crazy thing that Donald Trump does and puts out. And we say, okay. It is violence perpetrated against another political figure using AI. It is meant to be funny. They had YMCA in the background. And I guess I just want to say that this represents a continuation of a moral collapse. It's like this sensation of being boiled like a lobster. And the water gets hotter and hotter, and then eventually we die. And I just want to say it's unacceptable. I want to say, for the record, and I hope you will also agree with me, this is unacceptable, this kind of antagonism, and specifically against President Obama and the first black president, putting him in jail. It's absolutely insane. And so I just want to, I wanted to not let this just go by and not say something. We can't just get anesthetized. We can't just say, oh, okay, this is the new normal. It's not normal. It will never be normal, what is happening. We can't let it be normal. And I'm sorry, but all these Christians who have their Christian in their bio on social media, and they let this be normal, no, So I hope you'll join me in not normalizing cruelty and not normalizing stupidity and not normalizing the attack on other political figures. And let's normalize democracy. Let's normalize decency. Let's normalize morality. And now to my guest. Rabbi Dr. J. Michaelson is a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and a field scholar at the Emory Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality. He is the author of 10 books and a journalist whose work appears on CNN and Rolling Stone and in his weekly Substack newsletter, which I highly recommend, Both and with J. Michaelson. For 20 years, Jay's work has been focused on the intersection of politics and religion, and he worked as a religious LGBTQ activist also for 10 years. He holds a PhD from Hebrew University, a JD from Yale Law School, and has a non-denominational rabbinic ordination. Rabbi Dr. J, welcome back to the State of Belief.
Thanks, Reverend Paul.
I wanted this week to talk about something that I didn't think I was going to want to talk about, but then I started wanting to talk about it, which is everything that's going on with the Epstein files and this administration and what appears to be, a massive effort at distraction and cover-up that now includes some legal maneuverings that I suspect you have been following. So let's just start from what we understand to be the facts of this case, and then go to this current moment of what clearly is becoming a perceived and maybe real crisis for this administration.
Sure. I actually, with your permission, even want to take a half step earlier before going into the facts of the case, starting with your ambivalence, which I think most progressives probably share, right? Which is like, why are we talking about this? And we can go down the litany of things, which I think are probably higher up on our own consciences and things that we feel are more politically urgent. But I want to suggest that we should be talking about this for a couple of reasons. First, I think a lot of progressives really made a mistake in 2024. And I'm not just the campaign, the Harris campaign, but just progressives in general, where we talked about what we want to talk about and what we think is important, not what vast swaths of the American mainstream think is important, right? We talked about economic issues now and then, but over and over again, you and I talked a lot about Trump's threats to democracy. Well, good for us. We were right, but it doesn't profit us to be Cassandra, right? Now we're living with Trump's threats to democracy being very real and actualized because our side couldn't prevail in that election. I think had there been a little more listening to what voters were really caring about and not dismissing their economic concerns, but really trying to get to the core of it. Our first answer was sometimes, well, of course, Trump's not going to help with any of that, you idiot. That's also not helpful, right? I think it's easy to Monday morning quarterback any election, but I think we could learn from that experience that it's worth paying attention to the issues that half the country, at least, it wants to pay attention to. And this is now one of those issues. So that's the first reason. But it's not just politically expedient, right? So obviously, there are more important things, although at the core of the Epstein saga are some pretty heinous crimes. Still, on an order of magnitude basis, there may be more important things. But this does represent a fundamental breach of trust that not just the MAGA faithful, but a lot of others placed in Donald Trump. Obviously, we might say misplaced, but that's a big deal, right? And that is an issue that spiritual progressives should care about, right? About issues of trust, of honesty, of transparency. And there's a challenge whenever the conspiracy theorist comes into power, because then there's no conspiracy, and then they become the conspiracy. And that's exactly what's happened here. And I'll confess to being not quite an Epstein truther, but an Epstein doubter, I guess, about how he died and who was involved in that and what. And certainly my own conspiracy theorizing has taken a big leap forward in the last 2 weeks based on some of the twists and turns of the way the story has happened. But, I think that fundamental question about trust, is Donald Trump in your corner or not, Is he a con man or not? Is he really going to overturn some of the fundamentals of what the deep state stands for, or not? And I think we can pair the Epstein saga as it is now with the budget, right? Where a lot of folks who were paying attention on the right side of the political spectrum saw that Trump sold them out, right? That this
Yeah.
was a tax break for billionaires at the expense of people getting Medicaid. And, there's might be some like racist tropes that the Medicaid recipients are people of color in urban areas. As you know, that's not true, right? There are a lot of white folks in rural areas who also depend on Medicaid and other forms of government assistance. And this really hurts a lot of people. So I think these two issues pair together,
Mm.
and they go to how Trump's own base perceives his betrayal.
The framing is important, and also like to recognize it does matter. This is really important, and in part it's important because you can see how hard they're trying to not have it be important. And I think Nancy Pelosi was like, we need to talk about like kitchen table issues, and I'm like, well, yeah, but
But this is a kitchen table issue. I mean, I
yeah,
understand
yeah,
there's a kitchen table, but
yeah,
this is
yeah.
maybe a dining table issue, right? This is what people talk about.
My weirdness about it and my confession about it is like I always just assumed that Donald Trump was in the Epstein files. Like that was never in doubt to me. Like I was, just like, well, obviously he is. And that's what's the disconnect for me is that obviously he's in it. I mean, I don't know if that's slanderous at this point, but it just feels like everything else he's done, all these egregious attacks on women, all the way he showed up in like these Miss Teen America or whatever pageant, like, how could he not be there?
Yeah,
and so
there's
like
a mountain of circumstantial evidence. All the pictures, the fights, the flaring fights.
All of it.
Card,
so,
we both like young women or something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, but all of like even way when all the Epstein stuff was going on, whenever it was really going on, I was like, of course Trump's a part of it. And no, so that's the reason. Like a little bit for me, it's just like, oh, we're talking about this now.
Right. What is different now is that Trump has decided to do a 180 on whether the files exist and whether it's important or not. And for several years, he's played a pretty daring game because I agree. I mean, obviously, if there is a client list, which there probably is not, surely he's on it, right? He's been playing this game of alleging a deep state cover-up. Okay, now, I mean, he can't say that that's still happening. He's thrown out everyone qualified from the FBI and the DOJ, and it's filled with loyalists in every direction, whether it's Pam Bondi, Dan Bongino, Kash Patel. These are not deep state folks. And now he just did a 180. And so I think the difference is that it's, there's the thing, it's not the crime, it's the cover up. I mean, I think that is largely true in this case because the cover up comes after years of egging people on to demand what's in those files. And this is the age of social media, right? I've personally seen a dozen, Instagram reels and TikToks of Pam Bondi saying we've got to release the files, JD Vance saying we've got to release the files, and Trump himself. So that's why we're talking about it now. I mean, I think there was still a feeling like, okay, pretty soon now we're going to get those files. We got, and he declassified, one of his failed attempts at misdirection was the MLK files. That's a really good distraction for us because there's really a lot in there that's quite troubling from the government surveillance point of view.
Right.
Dr. King.
Yeah.
So we got that, but we didn't get this. I think that's why we're talking about it now. This is like the clearest betrayal. And these guys believed this conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And, turning to the facts for a minute, it's really not clear there's not the Epstein files. Right. There's not, there are dossiers and files that have been kept on him as part of the criminal prosecution. Apparently, some of those were just still sitting in the Southern District. They hadn't been turned over to the feds. Did he videotape people's encounters with? No, I'm probably not. There's not going to be, I wouldn't think, a smoking gun that's so bad that this actually endangers, it puts someone in danger of prosecution. But then again, if there weren't something bad in there, why not release the files? So the more he refuses to release them, the more reasonable people, which means even us, the more reasonable people start to think there maybe is something in there. But maybe it was just that, you can never really guess the mind of Trump. We don't know why he took those classified files and hid them in his bathroom either. So we don't really know why he does what he does, but it is possible that just having his name appear somewhere in flight logs would have been seen as too damning. But The one thing that I would not predict is whether he gets out of this or not. It's really hard to ever say. I mean, we everybody thought on January 6th, 2021 that this guy's career was cooked, right? And Mitch McConnell, who could have led a bipartisan effort to
Yes.
convict him in the impeachment trial, the second impeachment trial, said there's no point in doing this. He's over. He's never coming back. So I never count the Donald out. And we're old enough to remember when he went bankrupt a couple of times, I think in the 90s. And we're like, all right,
Yeah.
Donald Trump,
Yeah.
he's cooked. He's
He's a
over.
joke.
Everyone
Yeah.
knows he's a con artist now. And,
Yeah.
then came The Apprentice. So,
We don't know whether it's enough, but I do think it would be helpful to have like a smarty pants like you give a little bit of what has been happening. Like just in this week, there have been kind of legal things that have been happening that indicate something, and I think many of us don't really understand what it means to do this and that, and with this person doing it rather than that person doing it, I mean, and I'm one of those people. But it does feel like there have been efforts, for a second it was like, well, we're going to open the grand jury, files, but then that wasn't happening. So can you just give us a little bit of like, what has legally been happening and what the maneuvers that have been happening and where Pam Bondi is in all of this and who are the other actors? Can you?
So the most recent turn, I would say, in the saga is an attempt to get a judge to unseal the grand jury transcripts from one of I think it's the Epstein trial or the Maxwell trial. It's from the criminal trials, and this is a way to kind of have your cake and eat it too. So Pam Bondi has now said there's no such thing as the Epstein files. That's probably a lie, but this might be a way for her to say for them to put out into the public some information, while it not being Epstein files, right? Because it's the grand jury transcripts. So far, that effort has not been successful because the judge said you can't just unseal grand jury findings any time you want, right? There's there's specific exceptions to the rules that keep grand jury transcripts and materials secret. If there's an ongoing prosecution, that is one of the rules you can unseal, but you can't just say unseal the documents. So far, that the government's not been successful. I mean, I think to me, I see it as a kind of tactical move. It is a legal move, but it's really a tactical move to somehow get something out there while not being caught on the lie. I mean, maybe she'll say, next week, oh gosh, I forgot they were over here in this closet that I lost the files, and then she'll release some files. But I don't really know. It's also possible that this evidence has been destroyed. Right? I mean, I don't know if these are physical materials, if they're digital materials. Either way, it's quite possible they were just destroyed. And there really is now nothing to release. So again, this is a way of kind of getting something out there without it being the main thing. So it could be that they exist and that they're extremely incriminating. It could be that they just don't exist. It could be that they used to exist but were destroyed. And in any case, this was a kind of a legal maneuver to satisfy this political end. I mean, the same, right? I mean, the same with Mike Johnson closing the U.S. House of Representatives to avoid any kind of investigation, which might also, a congressional investigation might also require those materials to be unsealed. So that's sort of the legal wrangling. But I think the real, Trump's phrase that I never noticed it in the first term, but, they're now supercuts of his favorite phrase in about 2 weeks. And that reflects a judgment on his part that nobody has the attention span of more than 2 weeks, right? We're going to give you that health plan in about 2 weeks. We're going to give you the budget in 2 weeks, the peace deal in Russia and Ukraine in about 2 weeks. And he knows the media cycle very well, better than either of us do. And he knows that 2 weeks is an eternity, and he can come up with some other stuff. It does scare me to think about how big the distractions might get, right? I mean, could there be some like a war? Could there be some horrible crackdown? I would say that if Trump, were to institute something like martial law, maybe we would stop talking about the Epstein files. And so it gives me pause to consider how far he might go. But it seems the real question is about 2 weeks. Now we have probably, about 8 weeks, at least until Congress is back in session, or 7 weeks. And so will media's attention continue? So far, MAGA hasn't let up. It's weird that we're relying on them, but they're pissed. I mean, the news as we're recording this today is the QAnon shaman has disavowed Trump.
And after all Donald did for him. Up next, much more with Jay Michaelson. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is Rabbi Dr. Jay Michaelson. Now, what about Maxine? What is her name? Ghislaine? I don't know how to pronounce
Ghislaine Maxwell.
it. Ghislaine Maxwell. How do you understand the effort to? I mean, if DOJ, I don't know, who has control over her fate, and who might be able to, and I know we're getting into conspiracy theories here, but who might be able to influence what she's going to say if she does go public, in order to get pardoned by Trump.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's not a conspiracy theory when it's just the meetings are acknowledged. It's been reported.
Yeah.
It's we're not, I guess it is a conspiracy in some way, but it's not, we're not saying that you have to do your research. You can just Google it and, credible reports from all kinds of journalists will come up. Yeah, I mean, I think it might be a question of what's her price, and right. I guess that's where we get into the conspiratorial side. Do we think that these meetings are really to see if she has any relevant information, or to, offer her freedom plus who knows what else in exchange for a kind of NDA?
Right.
Who knows, right? I mean, she would know, right? She probably, right? She was the handler for Jeffrey Epstein, and she facilitated a lot of these illegal criminal acts with underage women, and who knows what she knows. It's interesting that in such a relatively short period of time, really just the last 6 to 9 months, Trump has so consolidated his hold on the party that it's hard to locate any other power centers. Right. You could imagine in a normal party situation, there'd be one circle around the president, but then there'd be others who are over here who are a little ambitious on their own and who might have interests. And
that's what I don't understand. Why are no other Republicans who might be trying to actually win in 2028 beginning to break away? What senator, or are they too afraid of the MAGA base that they feel like they can't?
I think they're reading the tea leaves. I mean, I think it'll be interesting if some of the renegade Republicans, who've broken with Trump already, or who have said they're not seeking re-election, kind of take this up. But those haven't tended to be the most conservative. Ironically, right? It's the most conservative, the closest to the MAGA base, who are the most outraged by this.
Isn't that interesting?
I don't know. I mean, I think if you have made your career being part of MAGA and having that base, I think you might want to read the tea leaves, or at least wait another month, right? I mean, let's see if this just goes away and we all stop talking about it and we move on to the next thing. And like he always does, Trump always gets away.
It hasn't been a place where a lot of religious leadership has weighed in. Obviously, there's the huge, just fundamental outrage of the attack on girls, and how, terrible it all is. But we already, in some ways, for those of us who might speak out, we kind of already know that and knew that. And so I have not heard all the religious leadership just say, go all in on Epstein and Trump, because it feels so obvious. I don't know. What is your thought about that?
I mean, it's been a right-wing obsession for almost a decade at this point. And I think it's not the kind of politics we generally do on the religious progressive side of the, we don't really go in for the conspiracy mongering, even if at its core, there is a real crime that is serious. I think people are more focused on what we consider to be substantive issues, ICE, creeping authoritarianism, whatever name your Trump horror. And that, I think, reflects a certain maturity of conscience and of civic responsibility to focus on the important stuff and not focus on the distractions. But I am making a case both for, I would say, expediency, but also on principle, that this is an issue that we have to take up. And you don't get to pick what the moments are that necessarily catalyze public opinion. I'll take a kind of dramatic example. In the Vietnam War, there's a horrible picture of the young girl running from napalm, right? And no one chose that as the moment at which the inhumanity of the Vietnam War was going to be discussed. And someone could say, okay, well, this was one girl, but what about this? What about the My Lai massacre? What about this other thing that's much worse? What about that? But it's not how politics works, right? And this is the occasion that has brought up these fundamental issues of Trump not being true to his base, which I think is a pretty core point, right? And again, we just drive ourselves crazy talking about it. I will say more about that in a second. About I want to make sure to reference When Prophecy Fails and talk about that book. But it also is actually about sexual violence and the predation of women. There's just this isn't entirely on point, but I just saw a really trenchant quote from Alan Cumming, the actor, queer entertainer, who said, "Why would a rapist?" This is about the transgender myth that trans women are actually sexual predators in disguise. He said, "Why would a rapist go to the trouble of pretending to be transgender when our society treats rapists so much better than transgender people?" It's like, do you think of like how our society has protected sexual predators from the president on down? I won't make a rape allegation, but just sexual
and
predators.
I'll say, just referencing like Christian Dumais' work about how conservative Christian groups have covered up predatory actions by pastors and things like that, and without repercussion, and there's a religious element to that we all very well know.
Well, we can surface that. I mean, I think we should be surfacing that, right? And I think we make jokes in the gay community a lot about the homophobic pastors who then get busted with male sex workers or whatever. But this is serious, right? I mean, this is about projection. It's seeing the challenging parts of one's own shadow that you haven't integrated, that you haven't found a way to work with in an appropriate and ethical way, and projecting what you see to be the worst of those, or the most sinful or the most violent of those tendencies onto this other. Right. Uh-huh. And so sometimes the other is a transgender woman, and sometimes the other is the elite circle of elite pedophiles. But I don't think this moment is big enough to be a reckoning with that. That seems to be as old as the Bible and othering people and projecting qualities, negative qualities onto them. But it is also that. It is also that moment. And I think, again, one reason that we're reticent to talk about it is that the exploitation of women has been so weaponized, right? Not just in the case of transgender people, but also in the case of sex trafficking and I scare quoted that for people who are listening, because there's real sex trafficking, which obviously is horrifying, and then there's an entire huge right-wing myth, including some pretty decent selling movies, that sex trafficking is a massive, millions of children are being trafficked, which is absolutely impossible, and mind-boggling and false. And it's this terrifying narrative. And that, of course, feeds into the dominant QAnon narrative, that there is this sort of elite network of pedophiles that's running all of the systems of government, politics, media, etc.
And that's where you get the kind of attack on that pizza shop, and they were like, Hillary Clinton has like this pedophilia ring, and there's so much insanity, but then there's the reality, which is actually involves their favorite guy, and that's what I think. I think you're like, in all the messiness of this comes up why this is so massive and convoluted, but clearly something is erupting, and they wouldn't be trying so hard to distract if something if something really scary to Trump wasn't going on.
Right. Well, at this point, they've lied so many times, it's hard to see where they go from here, right? So first they lied about the existence of all of these files, which name names, and you expected to see Bill Clinton's name on a list with a
Right.
client list or whatever. Maybe that was true. It doesn't seem like it was. There's no evidence that that kind of thing exists. Then they lied and said it didn't exist. so somewhere, but I do think I mentioned this. So for folks who are listening, I wrote one of my books is about a false messiah in the 18th century, and so to do the research around that book, I took a deep dive into cults, messianic movements, and secular as well as religious. Trump's movement is both secular and religious. And what often happens in cases of disappointed prophecy. So the end of the world is predicted in 1848 or 1973 for the Jehovah's Witnesses, or the aliens coming for the Heaven's Gate cult, or all of these kinds of whenever. So a scholar named Leon Festinger wrote a book almost 50 years ago now called "When Prophecy Fails." And he studied some of the UFO cults. We don't really use a cult anymore, that word, but whatever, I'm going to use it, to study what happens. And generally what happens is a lot of the outer layer of support disappears, but usually the inner layer doubles down. And they end up saying, well, actually, the redemption would have happened had we just been better. Like, we weren't pure enough.
Right.
We had to do this other thing, or the world wasn't ready. In the case that I studied, there was a mass messianic movement in Judaism in the 17th century, and turned out the Messiah converted to Islam rather than take the throne of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And so most of the people who were following him left, but the core said, no, he's still the Messiah. They then converted to Islam outwardly while retaining their messianic faith inwardly. So this dynamic, and it happened with Aum Shinrikyo in Japan. It happens again and again and again. It's interesting to see if that will happen here. What's different here is that it's actually been some of the truest believers from QAnon shaman down who are turning first. And it's actually kind of the people who have joined on the Trump train for more expediency reasons, who are saying, oh, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing to see here. We're not going to keep going. The lesson of When Prophecy Fails, and for a book that was written actually 70 years ago, it's held up remarkably well. There's more there are corrections around the scholarship here and there, but the core thesis has held on really well. The suggestion of that book is that nothing will shake the faith of the truest of the true believers, and that they will find a way to explain whatever's happening. And TBD, right? It's an interesting moment to speculate as to whether that will happen here, as it has in, I love the founding story of Christianity is arguably when prophecy fails, right? Christ came, the redemption did not come in the way that had been prophesied. And when, after he died or didn't die, I'll leave that. We can have that conversation some other time, Reverend. Right? The faith changed. Right. And it changed the formula. It's like, well, he had to die in order to die for our sins.
Of course it did.
So,
I mean, that's exactly what happened. Of course it did. I'm playing into your.
So no, that's the point. I mean, how this dynamic might unfold in the case of Trump, who obviously we've talked about, I think, on the program before, fills a sort of messianic role. This kind of there's a legislator, I forget which state, Oklahoma, I think, who literally said unironically that we should refer to Trump as Daddy Trump. And there was a gay member of that same state legislature who said, I don't know if you want to know about that in my community.
Oh my God, Daddy Trump.
Right, so we don't have to go far to look for the projection of the father figure and the abusive father figure. And it's an interesting question. I just read an interesting take that no one can truly love Trump without also hating Trump, just as you can't love the abusive father without also partly hating the abusive father, because that is who he is. He's that figure projected, that the daddy of the movement. And I don't know. I think it's an interesting time to be recording this episode, because it's at this moment,
things are in
someone
flux.
Goes back and listens to this moment from late July 2025. I don't think it's possible to predict which way this story goes.
That's I do think it's going to be if we're able to talk about history in the future, this will be an interesting historic moment, just in some ways, just to watch an administration throw so many things at the public at one time really try to see what sticks. It's so frenetic, and you're just and really terrible things. So as you like kind of you're watching the Epstein files, and I really do think this. I think this damages him somehow going forward. I don't know that it's going to damage him so much. He's never going to step down. It would have to be forced out, and I don't know that there'll ever be a political will to do that at this point. But let's widen the aperture, shall we, and talk about like how do we understand this moment in the 6 months into Trump's return, what he's been able to do, and where we are as a nation.
So I am not one of those who jumps on criticism of the quote mainstream media all the time. I think that's a little overdone and I think it's lazy. I am surprised and disappointed that the daily horrors coming from ICE are not always headline news
Yeah.
in the mainstream media outlets. I'm still getting them, but I'm getting them from, now I've become I'm definitely not a Gen Z-er, but I'm getting my news like one. And I'm experiencing some of that mistrust of mainstream media that a lot of folks on right, left, and center, I think, have, because it does feel to me as though this kind of Gestapo-like police state that is happening right in front of our eyes and that is about to grow fourfold next year with the increase in budget is absolutely horrifying. Right. There were ICE agents at a baseball practice in New York City the other day, and they were interrogating 11-year-olds and 14-year-olds. A report today, and that the coach had to stop them and risk his
Yeah.
own life and freedom to do so. There's a report today in the Washington Post, or what's left of the Washington Post, that ICE has a plan to tag 180,000 legal immigrants with ankle bracelets to track their movements. Those are people who are here legally. Right. Obviously alligator Alcatraz and the cruelty and dehumanization of immigrants and what that really represents about. Anyway, I could go on. I'm disappointed and a little outraged that this is not more visible. I think the second thing I just wanted to say, like, how has he been able to do this? There's a tendency, this is obviously not Trump, right? And I wish this fact could be internalized by normal American voters, the kind who don't listen to podcasts like this one. When we vote for a president, we're voting for thousands of people, right? We're voting for a whole
Right.
apparatus.
That's right.
And as we said, again, being Cassandra doesn't really console very much, but as we said a year ago right now, right, the far right conservative infrastructure prepared for this administration the way they did not prepare for the first administration.
Right.
And so, what we're seeing now in terms of like the ravaging of the government, this is more Russell Vought than it is Donald Trump, right? We're seeing the kind of advent of post-liberalism and anti-democratic thinkers right in the inner circle of the White House. One of those thinkers, Yoram Fazoni, just gave a speech glowing about how many close friends he has working in the White House to kind of destroy a lot of the democratic protections that he thinks we shouldn't have. So there's kind of I guess the word coming to mind is army. There's an army of these folks who are doing this work. And whereas I think the Epstein story is really about Donald Trump personally, what's really happened over the last 6 months has been a remarkably competent effort by extreme right-wing forces, including better-known people like Stephen Miller, for example, to transform the federal government in not an old-school Ronald Reagan small government way, but a new authoritarian big state, led by a strong executive kind of way. We've never had that before. Maybe a little bit with FDR. Did we ever have this strong of an executive? And it again is kind of, you do see that a lot of Americans are willing to put up with it. And the issues that they seem to care about the most, right? They do still care about the economy. Trump is doing very badly, pulling very badly on the economy. He's also pulling badly on immigration. People do think he's gone too far, arresting the people who are cutting their lawns and renovating their houses and picking their produce and who were here in some kind of a legal process and
Right.
some kind of a legal process and, are honest people trying to make a living. So the numbers are encouraging, but I guess I'll be a little self-serving. The Substack piece I'm putting out tomorrow is extreme pessimism about the fairness of the 2026 election, based on
Yeah,
efforts that are already underway to make it
right.
very, very difficult for Democrats to win anywhere competitive. And we could talk about that, but that's where a lot of I might be sort of, it might be an avoidance mechanism on my part that I'm thinking about November 2026 instead of August 2025. But I am focused there
No, I
right
think you
now.
have to be because they're focused on it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
they're completely focused on it because they recognize that they're unpopular, and so they're trying to figure it out. I mean, Texas is just one of the most blatant examples of
Right.
trying to get the five more districts and essentially disenfranchising an entire population of Texans
Well,
from
and what
having.
happens? Just imagine. I mean, Jackson Heights, Queens is quiet right now. Immigrant neighborhoods all around the country are quiet. There are places where day workers used to congregate to get work are now empty and devoid of people because they're right to be frightened, right?
Yes,
And these aren't cowardly people or fearful people. They're just responding to the fact that ICE is randomly arresting anyone brown anywhere,
right.
even if they're a citizen and have their papers, and then detaining people at airports as well. I'm actually reluctant to fly overseas right now and then come back, just because who knows what lists any journalist is on. I think you should be too. So imagine that happens in November of 2026. And
Yeah,
there's ICE patrols anywhere near polling places. Would
that's
you
right.
risk your life and your freedom and being with your family just to cast a vote in some election? Or just imagine how many districts that impacts. And they don't have to be at the polling place. They could just be in the neighborhood. They could just spend
Yeah.
a few days in November, generally in the area of the polling places, and let it be known that they're doing controls there. And that scares off, uncounted legal American citizens who are trying to vote, because being an American citizen, if you're brown, is not a defense of being about from being picked up by ICE and then at least detained for several days in inhumane conditions. And that's if you're lucky. You can be a Marine and do it. That's happened, right? There's all kinds of ways to find yourself suddenly in the wrong end of this authoritarian police force, and I'll repeat, which will be 4 times as large next
Yeah.
year as it is now.
Yeah, that's right. Um, again, because I always unfortunately have to ask you, we're watching two different sagas, but very similar in some ways, what's happened to Harvard and to Columbia, but like, how this attack on higher education and what it looks like, and some of the rationale, which includes like, well, we're defending the Jews, and Jews are mostly saying, don't pin this on us. But how do you understand this moment for higher education as someone who,
Has a lot
like
of it.
me, well, has a lot of it, but also recognizes how important it is for democracy, and
Uh,
how, the role it's played in developing a democracy and developing an infrastructure for well-being for the people, and yet that is like it's completely a target.
Yeah, that's right. We can put in the show notes a long-ish article I just did for the Forward newspaper on, we should, at least within the American Jewish community, we should recognize that we've been played, right? There are numerous other reasons that Republicans have stated for going after higher education, and it's clear that anti-Semitism is a pretext. It
Yeah,
is nothing more than that, and it's really despicable that the engine for the Jewish American dream in the 20th century, which was access to higher education, that is being shredded in the 21st, again with this fake rationale of defending the Jews. I think I want to say, I think knowing some of the people involved in both the Harvard and Columbia negotiations, it's very easy to sit in judgment of institutions capitulating to the government. Columbia, as we're recording this, Columbia's settlement came out today. It's pretty fierce and in a bad way. It is very depressing to read. And yet, at the same time, this is a potential existential risk for these institutions and for thousands and thousands of people whose jobs and livelihoods depend on these already promised government research grants. I am friends personally with several scientists at institutions who have had their grants canceled in the middle of their work, and they
Right,
suddenly, there's no money. And
right.
these people have families. They also have ongoing studies, right? And a lot of times, also, with physical science, they're in the middle of their work, and their funding is pulled. So I'm not defending Columbia's deal. I'm just saying, the rush to, it's easy for us to judge when we don't have that much at stake.
Yeah.
And so I recognize what a difficult situation these institutions are in. And I could contrast it with the craven bullshit going on at CBS, hiring of all
Oh,
people. They're going to, Paramount CBS Skydance is going to hire Barry Weiss to be an ombudsman of the news. That is
oh,
absolutely despicable. Talk about a con artist, somebody who's lied about her supposed liberalism for her entire career, whose quote unquote news site publishes wildly inaccurate conspiracy theories and totally unsource checked reporting. This is the person who's going to decide whether CBS News, I mean, CBS News is going to be the new Fox News, right? And of course, the firing of Stephen Colbert, which seems almost certainly connected. And now we know there were even meetings with Trump officials, administration officials, before the firing happened. So I would contrast these two things. One, really just trying to make a lot of money by selling out big media to the government. Another, really trying to save some of these critical
yeah,
institutions.
yeah. I'm getting a lot of my thoughts around Columbia because Brad, my husband, went to Columbia, both undergraduate and PhD, and I think he has a sense of betrayal from what he understood to be Columbia to be. As an institution, and I think what you're saying makes all kinds of sense. It's just it is very it's such a crisis, and here we are. But the well, we still are able and must speak out. I mean, and the other thing that both you and I have true is that we are gay and we have children. It's a real scary time in that regard, and the question of traveling with kids and the crazies out there. So I'm not asking you to talk about your children, but the reference point for like what do we do? And
Well, we don't do an Andrew Sullivan. So, in case anyone was curious if by selling out the trans people, gay people would save ourselves, bisexual people just got erased from the Stonewall Monument, just like trans people were erased previously. This week in Florida, a Florida U.S. attorney sent notice to a restaurant that held a Pride event and asked for customer lists of everyone who had dinner at the restaurant during the Pride event, saying it violated Florida's anti-drag law by having sexualized drag performances in a place where minors might have been present. So they're absolutely coming for us. These are maybe smaller issues than our marriage unrecognition and the other things that I think we should be thinking about. It's a moment where I think I did in my Substack. I don't find a lot of consolation in the political realm. I'm finding consolation only by zooming way back, to our religious traditions, to contemplative traditions, and knowing that this is not the first time that people have lived through very difficult times. It's just like Gandalf said to Frodo, this is not, we wish that we weren't born into times like these, but we were. And that's what our responsibility is. It's dictated by that. And I don't have the happy ending because I'm so skeptical of the 2026 election. I want to hasten to say the election will happen. There will be a 2026 and a 2028 election. But there was a 1936 election in Nazi Germany. Just the Nazis won 98% of the vote. So just because there's going to be an election doesn't mean there's going to be change.
mm,
And I'm so I don't have a lot of optimism in the political sphere, and I'm gaining spiritual resilience from, I guess I would say, yeah, like I said, zooming back to a bigger perspective.
Rabbi Dr. J. Michaelson is a writer, journalist, and meditation teacher. Jay is visiting professor at Harvard Law School and is the author of 10 books, including his newest, The Secret That Is Not a Secret, 10 Heretical Tales. His Substack newsletter is both and with Jay Michaelson. Jay, you're a big bummer, but I really appreciate having you back with us on
There's
the
a crack
State
in
of
everything,
Belief.
man. That's where the light gets in.
But listening and hearing and feeling less alone and recognizing that there are people, and we're not insane for thinking what we're thinking, there is a value in that and a power in that. And so I thank you very much for joining us on the State of Belief.
Thanks. Well, can I actually, I don't know if we have 1 minute, but I wanted to give the last word, not to myself, but to one of the million great quotes by Joanna Macy, who left us earlier this week. And I want to end with this. She once said, Joanna Macy, wonderful Buddhist teacher, environmentalist, bringing together ecological responsibility, poetry, contemplative practice. She said, "This is a dark time filled with suffering and uncertainty. Like living cells in a larger body, it is natural that we feel the trauma of our world. So don't be afraid of the anguish you feel, or the anger or fear, because these responses arise from the depth of your caring and the truth of your interconnectedness with all beings."
Who do you know who would get a lot out of this discussion with Rabbi Michaelson? Please share the State of Belief with them and be sure to subscribe to the State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to keep making the State of Belief, so please make a financial contribution today at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The news and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org and be sure to join us next week. I cannot wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on the State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.